Yes, well, as I said when we started, thanks for coming, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to say a few words too. And one of the things that some people may have been curious about is why do we need another secular or humanist or atheist or whatever association or grouping in South Africa or anywhere else for that matter? And the answer to that question is part of what I want to spell out today, because it's a combination, for me at least, of philosophical, political and practical motivations, and will hopefully become clear before far too long. Because I think that there's a realignment or a reconceptualization of strategy that's needed, and that's really what I'm going to be talking about today. But as a starting point, let me make it clear that I in no way intend to diminish or demean the work done by various individuals and associations in defending free thought and rationality in this country and elsewhere, although there aren't that many in this country. I'm proud to myself of being associated with the ones that have existed, yet I often fear that coherence and organization has been lacking, as Leo pointed out from the beginning as well. We start out with good intentions, but we rely on goodwill and the motivation of individuals rather than having robust structures in place and plans of action. And then we find our enthusiasm waning as time passes or as volunteers are hard to find. And part of the reason for this is a splintering that occurs into various groups or factions, some calling themselves humanists, some free thinkers, some agnostics, some atheists. And one of the things I want to emphasize today is that these fragmented various headquarters or centers of operation seem to forget the underlying and quite obvious truth that we're fighting the same battle, and should therefore join forces, or at least be aware of what everyone else is doing, to find synergies where possible. And this battle is a genuine one. I mean, despite the fact that the majority of the human race, at least in terms of their day-to-day lives, are fully committed to the tenets of reason and the principles of scientific inquiry that most of our activities presume or rely on to run smoothly, we still have parents teaching their children to believe in sky gods. We still encounter tax breaks or preferential treatment being afforded to organizations premised on what is effectively Iron Age mythology. And we still run the risk of having law and policy being influenced and dictated by people who claim to have personal relationships with invisible friends. Despite the fact that many of these people are generous and friendly, none of this can be counted on or relied on to be benign, and we should therefore remain on our guard. And as atheists or free thinkers or secularists, or however you want to define yourself, one thing we should certainly remain on guard against is complacency and arrogance. The mantra of the secular movement has long been that we are guided by reason rather than by dogma and superstition. But as some of our critics have pointed out, the tone of our discourse and the uncharitable nature of our engagements with believers has often appeared to be as dogmatic and as intolerant as the things to which we profess opposition. We sometimes forget that it's not enough to be right. To win this war, we need to persuade people that we are right, and that sometimes requires more subtlety, more finesse, and more strategy than we sometimes allow for. Beating someone about the head with your logic stick is unlikely to have them leaving the exchange as a sympathizer, rather than as someone who has simply had their existing prejudices against atheists reinforced. More important, perhaps, is that we become so comfortable with our arguments and with our essential rightness that we forget to even listen to what the opposition has to say. And this is part of the reason why we have some believers of various flavors amongst us today, who are also given opportunities to present their arguments. Our commitment that we need to remind ourselves of is that of judging arguments on their merits. So we should recall that strategy requires choosing your battles wisely, as all participants in a battle have a certain amount of currency to squander, or alternatively to wisely invest in potential future rewards. As an example, let me briefly turn to the recent nomination of Francis Collins to head up the National Institutes of Health, which, as many of you will know, had atheists up and down the aisles in apoplexy, given that Collins is an outspoken defender of the Christian faith. Most of us, I imagine, delight in quoting some of his more absurd utterances, and some of us claim to be genuinely afraid that a man whose worldview is polluted to this extent by metaphysics has been given the keys to the scientific kingdom, as it were. But any knee-jerk reaction to the appointment of Collins may not serve our long-term interests. There's no doubt that Collins is not the perfect candidate, and I would certainly prefer for the head of the NIH not to be a God-botherer, but is he perhaps nevertheless not the best available candidate? I worry that our negative reaction to his appointment is so immediate and so unthinking that this possibility never occurs to us. If it is true, then we should be concerned at being so unthinking, never mind whatever concerns we might still justifiably hold about Francis Collins. Reasons to suggest that he might be the best available candidate, not the best possible candidate, are obviously his impressive track record, especially an administrator, but partly as a scientist too. And this is a job where we should recall that being a competent administrator is perhaps the most important virtue. And he's demonstrated his skills in this regard by his successful completion of the Human Genome Project, under budget, on time. And of course, our main concern is that he might end up blocking research in directions that run contrary to his religious beliefs, or that he might reinforce the unfortunate notion that the demands of scientific inquiry and religion are happy bedfellows. They are not, and I've no doubt that mental contortions are often required when one tries to hold these positions simultaneously. But do we have any evidence that Collins has and does let his religious beliefs get in the way of his science? I don't think we do. And is evidence not the thing we claim to be guided by, to be driven by? Secondly, are we being consistent in this instance, where consistency of argument is again a principle that we hold dear, or at least claim to hold dear? I again think not. Instead, it's quite probably the case that there are scientists in various illustrious positions who hold views we think are odious, perhaps on gender relations, perhaps on race, perhaps on Zionism. But all these views are not interrogated as closely as those implicated in this atheist versus theist war, and we can therefore claim ignorance in that regard. All the while, we need to recall that Collins will no doubt attract significant amounts of funding, will most likely advance science and the scientific viewpoint more effectively than any other available candidate, despite his curious commitment to certain fairy tales. In other words, his appointment may end up representing a net gain for the secular cause, and that's something we should bear in mind. As I mentioned previously, we need to pick our battles, and this is one key recent instance of it. As soon as Collins indicates that he has directed the NIH in some way against reason or science, of course, we jump in with all of our cannons blazing. But until that time, the evidence we have suggests that he's a good man and that he cares about many of the same things we do. And we therefore come across as intolerant at best and as nasty and judgmental at worst for labeling him a failure before he's even had a chance to do anything to deserve our scorn. Perhaps he is able to separate his professional life from those particular beliefs that he has. I confess I'm skeptical, but in this, as in all cases, I aspire to be guided by the evidence rather than by my prejudices. We all recall, many of us, that at Atheist Alliance International in 2007, Sam Harris argued that we should stop calling ourselves atheists, as that does little than polarize opinion. Harris also pointed out, quite correctly, that we shouldn't need a word at all for what we believe, seeing as there seems little reason to define a philosophical position in opposition to a bundle of myths. I'm not going to make that claim today. I'm happy to support his sentiment insofar as we don't all need to be militant atheists. As Dennett points out, people like Dawkins, and Harris to a lesser extent, act as lightning rods. They lay plain the terms of the debate, the consequences of ignoring the dangers that are presented to us, the dangers to our Enlightenment ideals. So we certainly need such people fighting in our corner. But that doesn't mean there isn't room for other sorts of engagement, for other sorts of interference, for other sorts of strategy. And calling people misguided or stupid or irrational as your default strategy, as your starting strategy, is no way to get them to engage in debate with you. It's a non-starter in terms of debate. As much as we might despise the current situation, where religion is accorded respect as if it were a sensible way to derive policy or morality, we should be aware that short-term gains may come at a very long-term cost. It's easy, and those of us who are atheists in this room, we know it's easy to win any argument with a religious believer, as their evidence is almost exclusively incoherent, circular, or contradictory. And we can win those arguments till the end of our days, and perhaps feel noble or virtuous, or fulfilled in some way that we're contributing to the project of reason. But in the meanwhile, we're perhaps not doing very much to contribute to the growth of our agenda in society as a whole. The project of reason is perhaps not benefited by those personal victories. Are we effecting any significant social change by winning those victories? And even if we are there perhaps not more efficient ways to effect those changes? I mean, consider examples from Europe, consider examples such as that of Denmark, often cited as one of the most secular societies, or the most secular society on the planet, and also, of course, notably one of the societies with the lowest rates of crime on the planet, as an aside. A notable thing about public discourse in societies like that is that religion is hardly ever mentioned. Believers keep their beliefs to themselves, understanding those beliefs as a private thing. They don't ever think that they should be at all relevant to policy determination. It's an entirely separate type of discourse. Atheists and atheism, to a large extent, are redundant in societies like that. So the norm is that secularism and secular arguments are what dictate policy, and religious interactions become something akin to social gatherings. A large part of the reason for this is almost certainly their relative wealth and the accompanying sorts of education that the average South African can only dream about, where you don't have any need to comfort yourself with metaphysics, in a sense, on another cold and hungry night, if you're a day. In South Africa or in most developing countries, you certainly do. Now, the point is that we'll get there. Any country that resists various insanities like tariffs on trade that are premised on some misguided nationalism, or education systems which are premised on religious principles, etc., will get to the point, hopefully, where we are educated enough to not need these things anymore. As education and social welfare improves, we are no longer incentivized to believe in fairy tales, and therefore we will have no need for them. In the meanwhile, when people talk nonsense of various sorts about morality depending on religion, this was written before I heard you, of course, various sorts of nonsense such as that, or about the sanctity of the heterosexual union or whatever, we should point out that it's nonsense, sure. But the point I'm making here is that they're talking nonsense regardless of these metaphysical disputes, not only because of them. It's a matter of education. It's a matter of becoming an enlightened society. The because, in terms of linking it to the religious beliefs, is merely a descriptive claim. It's an account of their particular histories and how they got to have those particular beliefs. We need to care more about the normative, about how to persuade people to adopt a more considered view with regard to these issues, with regard to our real social dilemmas, our real educational dilemmas, etc., and to our lives in general. And along the way, we should remember that we are on the same side as many of the believers, as curious as it is to say something like that. We all want happier lives, which for all of us means less crime, which to all of us means the companionship of the right sort, material comfort, and so forth. They have a vision of how to get there, which involves persuading people to adopt bizarre and complicated worldviews, speaking to unknowable and unseeable entities, etc. Now, it's fairly clear from the outside that that strategy is in the long run doomed, because as people become more educated, they'll become less and less persuadable in terms of those regards, unless we forcibly indoctrinate them again via things like schooling. Those unfalsifiable packages of mythologies and dogmas and such, whatever package you choose to adopt, will start becoming less and less coherent and reasonable as time goes by. At the same time, we should remember that we see clear evidence, especially, if not any more than our anecdotal or experiential evidence, that we like narratives. We like narratives, especially when they are grand narratives, as a psychological fact of our species. So if we can stop the intrusion of religion into policy, into university timetables, into op-eds in newspapers, etc., we've already stripped it of most of its power. It's little or no threat that people huddle together to sing songs to a common cause. Football fans do it every weekend. I'll hopefully be doing it at 6 o'clock when Arsenal lose to Manchester United. Where the threat lies is in people tying their beliefs together in a package that they've been sold as Protestantism or whatever, whereby they can no longer think in the terms of providing arguments for their position, except for that foundational starting point, except for that item of faith, and whereby they essentially remove themselves from civilized conversation, whereby it becomes impossible to debate with them. And they remove themselves from conversation and from civil society, in that civilization is premised on an exchange, whether it's of goods or whether it's of ideas. It requires us to be able to talk to each other. So let us focus on the ideas, with some of us fighting those lightning rod battles, like at Dawkins. Others focusing on the equally important, but perhaps less sexy battles, against bad science, against dogma and superstition in education, in public policy. But let us remember all the while that it's the yearning for idealism, it's the yearning for a grand narrative that drives people to fundamentalism in the first place. Neiman recently reminded us in her book Moral Clarity of that exact point. The realism and pragmatism that most atheists ground their arguments on doesn't offer that utopian vision. So our arguments, our package, comes at that intrinsic disadvantage. That's a political reality that we do very well to bear in mind. So while we don't want to exchange the current set of myths with a different set of myths, and thereby perpetuate this infantilization of our species, we can at least set an example via reasoned and considered engagement with our opposition. With that in mind, what the FSI is hopefully going to be doing is, firstly, on a practical level, we'll be registered as an NPO, organizing events like this, hopefully inspiring each other and motivating each other to be those voices of reason in public policy, in things like schools, in things like politics. Just being a constant giggle, a constant reminder, but in ways, as I've emphasized repeatedly, in ways that understand and respect, firstly, the commonality of our interests, whether we're believers or non-believers, and secondly, remain true to our core principles. In other words, being reasonable, having these debates in a fair sort of way. I would hope that like-minded groups across the country might, in a sense, be attracted to this central repository of information or central kind of allying body and such like. And I would hope, as I said earlier on today, that all of you will stay in the conversation and contribute to it as well. Thank you. Are there any questions? Leo?
Yes. First of all, thank you so much. Such an inspiring presentation. I'm not sure I understood you very well, but you talked about voicing our concerns when you have appointments. Like, maybe there was an appointment, somebody that got an appointment. You were saying that, you know, we shouldn't maybe go on and start criticizing, disallow the person to move in and start and now watch how the person is performing, and based on that we can come up with criticism. I think that every person that is appointed has a track record. Yeah. When they're appointing somebody that has a track record of this kind of maybe openly evangelical and who tries to always present things from either a parochial Christian perspective, if they are trying to put the person in a public office or give the person an appointment, a political appointment, I think that it might be nice to come up with an article. It's not really attacking the person, but I kind of voicing out concerns. Let me give you an example. In Nigeria now we have President Jacques. Jacques was the governor of Katsina State when Amin Alawal was convicted. Yes, and you know, when he was appointed, he was nominated for the presidency. I told many of my friends that we will not make any progress in terms of abolishing Sharia law, in terms of making Nigeria a secular state, and in terms of moving on with issues like the death penalty. And I want to say, I'm right, you know, that was what I said that time. I think I'm correct, you know, because right now he has said that death penalty is the law of the country, and we're not going to make any change about it. And of course, he has left the northern part to, you know, to keep, you know, they're all having a lot of trouble. They're not ready to address those issues. What I'm trying to say here is this: when they are appointing somebody to the office who has a track record of this kind of either fanatical outburst or Christian evangelical interpretation of everything, it's important we voice that out just clearly, you know, and of course make some predictions as to, oh, with this kind of candidate getting into office, I'm not sure South Africa is going to make progress with this area,
Sure.
this area, and this area. So that's
Sure, I mean, just to respond, I mean, I agree with you entirely. The Francis Collins case is a different case, because we're talking about somebody who's a known creationist and a religious fellow, but we don't have any evidence of the overlap of those beliefs into his work. So the tone of the violence of the tone of objection to his appointment ignored that he seems able, so far on the evidence we have, to separate those two things. Your example and other examples we can find of perhaps people being policymakers in government who base everything on biblical principles, for example. In those cases, we certainly should campaign against their appointment, because we know that they're not thinking about the issues. They're just applying a template, in a sense. So I agree with you, but I think we're talking about different examples, perhaps.
Thank you, Chief, for the talk. It was very nice. I come here as a libertarian atheist, and I'm very happy. I like the idea that the society is going to be called the Free Society Institute. I think from the point of view of both strategic and of actually keeping to our principles, I think it's a very good idea to the one part of our of what defines free thinkers is the reason and rationality, but also of our commitment to freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of many things. And I think that we should join with other people, as you say, including believers. And I'm thinking about a lot of Republicans and a lot of conservatives have lots of ideas about freedom in terms of, say, government or economics, and to join with them in a kind of in the same way that Thomas Jefferson said, let's all be free. You can practice whatever religion, but it's away from the state. So to advance really strongly the idea of let's have freedom, because after all, the reason that we, as free thinkers, get so upset about religion is when it imposes its will via the government, via tax rebates, via policy. If it doesn't affect us through government and through laws, then we have no reason to be upset about it. So, and as a libertarian, I would say also try and make synergies with, say, the Free Market Foundation or those kind of organizations.
I agree. Good point. Yeah, there's lots of alliances which aren't necessarily obvious, which make perfect sense once you think about them. Yeah. Of course.
Jacques, let me just say that, as I said earlier, what you guys are doing, I really endorse. I genuinely do. I don't agree with the principles, but I endorse what you're doing. But it does seem to me, almost as an outsider, that there's this obsession with religion and this obsessive attempt to assault religion. If that's the case, let me tell you, I would join you in that. Honestly, I would. But my question to you is, let's assume that you eradicate the world of all religious influence. What makes your position, what are you going to replace it with? And what makes your position more tenable, more bearable, more preferable? Because you have to recognize the 20th century, humanism has a very poor track record now. I'm not trying to be controversial, I'm trying to understand what it is that is happening here.
Okay, well, I mean, what I would replace it with would be something which is falsified as a starting point. So if I or anybody else who speak from the sort of platform I do says something which is demonstrably false, then I have a pre-commitment to change my mind on that issue. But the whole point is that what I say appeals to empirical evidence and is therefore falsifiable. So I'm exchanging a set of things which are unfalsifiable and which are therefore exchangeable with any other package of unfalsifiable mythology for something which can be tested, which is held to account, which is held to scrutiny. The exact character of that thing, we've got some glimpses of in terms of, as the example I cited earlier on, in terms of Scandinavian nations in general, of societies being perfectly well regulated while having disposed of all of that metaphysical baggage. On our hostility to religion in general, religion is the thing which is most in our face, is the one simple part of the answer. The broad strategic aim is not only about religion, it's about, for me, it's about metaphysics in its entirety, with religion being one very obvious and prominent aspect of that. But other aspects as well might include economic policy. Another aspect which is certainly involved is bad science. I'm equally offended by people believing in homeopathy and the healing power of crystals as I am by religion. So it's not just about religion. It's, to be honest, politically it's perhaps also a sexy topic. And a lot of people in this country are religious. And a lot of those people are our parents, or are our teachers, or are our leaders, etc. So it's a real threat to us, and that's why I think we focus on it. In terms of your last comment, I'm the bad track record of humanism. I know that you're going to cherry pick those obvious stupid examples, which aren't examples of humanist atrocities at all. So I mean, you can speak on it. You can tell us who it is you're thinking of, but I imagine it's the standard ones.
I don't want to cherry pick anything here. Look,
no, but you made the claim, so can you justify the claim?
More than 200 million people died, not at the hands of. I'm not defending religion, and this is a dangerous statement to me because it seems as though I'm trying to defend religion. I'm not. More than 200 million people died for reasons other than religious reasons in the 20th century.
But not atheist reasons.
Today alone, 126,000 babies are going to be aborted.
not for non-religious reasons.
You need fetuses.
Did you have fetuses?
Well, we can have that discussion as well. You can call
But
it
just-
zygotes, whatever you want to
Just
call
on a
it.
point of logic, there's again a false dichotomy there. Because they're not Christian doesn't mean they're doing it under the banner of atheism or humanism. It's an absurd argument.
Can I just ask one more question though? Aren't you replacing it with another religion though, Jacques? Because the US Supreme Court in 1961 recognized humanism as a religious institution.
That isn't at all relevant to the philosophical
No,
debate.
just ask it.
I don't believe it is.
You
And I-
disagree with the US Supreme Court? on
Yes,
that
of
one?
course I do in that case, and any rational person would.
Am I?
Yeah.
I have those.
Kent, yes.
I was just wondering if there is some place we could draw limits on sacrificing our principles for pragmatism. Yes, it might be quicker to achieve a certain result, but in the process, aren't we being somewhat?
I think there is that real danger. I certainly am not advocating that. I'm talking about the tone of the discourse. I'm saying that instead of saying to the person, you're an idiot, shut up, I don't want to talk to you, saying, you're wrong, here's why your argument is bad. And once you reach a point where it's clear they're not engaging with you in conversation, saying, I'm sorry, but this is a waste of my time, kind of thing. But that's a different approach to saying, you're, as a member of the species, not as worthy as I am, etc., etc. It's a matter of that. I agree, we shouldn't ever succumb to that temptation to betray the principles, no, but we can do them more politely sometimes. Andrew.
Well, yeah, once again, Doug, thanks for kind of a good overview of kind of strategic approaches, and it's something that I definitely want to talk about and engage more and get other people's ideas on, because there is conflict. There's conflict from that exact kind of conflict. To what extent do we compromise on our principles with pragmatism? But at the same time, a while ago, I did a bit of research on advocacy and started to think about different kinds of advocacy platforms and strategic approaches to persuasion and communication, rather than just the standard academic debate that we are so used to engaging in. And then at the same time, I heard a lot of criticism from the atheist community about Richard Dawkins' approach, the claim that it was strident, and you and I have had this discussion before. And something didn't sit right with me there. As you pointed out, it's important that there are people who take this kind of lightning rod position, who stretch the debate out, as it were. And that was my response to it, was to start to think about not so much convincing intellectuals, but about how does the public receive these kind of debates. And someone like a Dawkins coming out and saying, look, the God delusion, and pushing that agenda after the 9/11 travesty, basically opened up a whole lot of space for people who would otherwise be sitting around the dinner conversation table, having a chat, but would be afraid to actually voice their opinions. And by Dawkins putting himself right out there on the pole, it made it okay for other people to say, look, yeah, actually, I do agree with a lot of what he says, but I'm not as crazy as him. But still, that allowed people to come out. So I think strategically, that was a very good move. And I would argue the same thing as our West African colleague, that it's very important to come out with op-ed pieces and almost rabble rouse on the odd occasion. So when someone like a Francis Collins get put in there, yes, I hear what you're saying. We need to sit down and look at the track record. Yes, it's an administrative position. And I was gratified to hear that, in fact, he doesn't have influence over the funding agenda. That's decided by a bunch of colleagues. It's peer-reviewed as to where the funding goes. So it's not that he can directly influence that, although it may well be that he does. And if that happens, we should attack it. But I still think it's important for humanists, atheists, to stand up in that kind of situation and say, this is a position of science. Here's someone who we know has got books out there masquerading as science, when really all they are is personal expressions of his beliefs and views, his epiphany in front of a waterfall. That's not science, but the public holds it up as science. When you go to a church and you listen to people talking about what the scientists are saying, you'll see them put Francis Collins up there.
Yeah.
And they won't put him up there talking about the Human Genome Project. They'll say, head of the Human Genome Project knelt down before a waterfall and said this. Now, unfortunately, that's not science. And so he shouldn't, there's a confusion and a connection that gets made there, which I think a strategic approach, a rabble-rousing approach, this isn't acceptable, this isn't cool, there's other people out there who are qualified, who have the right kind of approach, would work. Then at the same time, sorry, I'm going on a bit here, but that negative approach, that rabble-rousing approach is important. But then at the same time, again, from looking at advocacy, I've started to think a lot more about what we need to do to reframe the debate, to stop us getting entrenched in theistic, anti-theistic kind of debates. Because frankly, I think the debate has won. I think among intellectuals, the debate has won. I have not heard yet a new argument from the theistic side. And I've done a lot of reading on this. And again, I listen to conferences, I watch the podcasts of these things. They simply don't come up. Guys like Christopher Hitchens will say exactly the same thing. They don't come across any new arguments. With respect, the argument that you put forward with respect to morality, again, it's been rolled out there many, many times and objected to, and I think convincingly, many, many times. A similar argument with respect to evolution being just a theory. That is a trope that has been rolled out so many times and addressed so many times. So I don't care any longer about debating with intellectual figures like that. What I care about is the man in the street, the kid going to the school. And I care about what kind of approach do we need to take to actually help reframe that debate, to get them not entrenched in theism. And there I see otherwise good-natured people looking to become good people getting caught up in, for example, Sunday morning ceremonies. And I can't object to that. I can't say to them, you shouldn't go there and try to become a better person. What I think we need to do is find a way to reframe that, find a way to not make that discussion about the superstition, find a way to make that discussion about the positive aspects of the kind of positive psychology that comes out of those meetings, the group solidarity, this kind of thing.
In my uncomfortable role as speaker and chair, I'll just shut you up.
Yes.
No, I think I agree entirely. I agree entirely with what you're saying. It's a matter of finding a balance. I mean, we need the lightning rods. There's a political issue there too, though. Who wants to be the lightning rod? Because you lose a bit of currency sometimes when you do that.
Oh, sure.
So I would almost want my undergrad students to be the lightning rods while I kind of sagely kind of moderate the discussion in a sense. So I'm a bit worried sometimes that our best, our brightest representatives take on that role sometimes. But so that's a strategy issue too. But I agree we need a balance of things. And yeah, I agree with what you said. Yeah.
So I'm glad that there is such an instance like this and the opportunity to discuss. But on a very pragmatic level, I would, the Free Society Institute, I'm curious as to where the initiative came from, where the money comes from. This is a very well organized conference.
The initiative came from myself and Ken sitting down there in that corner, and the money for this instance came from Leo, or via Leo, from the International Humanist and Ethical Union.
Thank you.
In future, thank you again. In future, we'll hopefully attract the same and more sponsorship, and I'll continue to steer it in the right places. Hopefully.
We'll ask for soft contributions afterwards.
Right, thank you. So while I'm here, I may as well proceed with introducing our next speaker.
Thank you, Jacques.